The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. There's still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, my group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Aloha, everyone. I'm geologist Philip Ong, here with Mr. Dane DuPont from Hawaii Tracker and H. Very, the Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute. Today is Thursday, September 7th, 2023, and Kilauea is still swelling, not erupted. Nothing extremely imminent, but we are still in this phase of the volcano having built up to imminent activity in a greater in a big picture, so to speak. So we'll cover all that today, Dane. But first of all, how are you doing?
Oh, doing pretty good. How about yourself?
Doing all right. Sounding a little loud there for a second.
Oh,
just so you know. It's been quiet on the surface. A lot of action underground. A lot of chatter online from our community here.
Yeah, it kind of triggers it every time she builds up and starts rumbling up there. Kind of triggers people, get a little bit excited. Some get a little bit more in tuned with what's going on. And, it's go ahead.
Yeah, it's always tricky to kind of gauge the timeline that this takes for the volcano to build up pressure and actually erupt. This is one of those times where we have a challenge with our human timescale living day to day. And the volcano, which operates more on a week to week or month to month kind of basis. And it does pop off from one day to the next, obviously. But the process to get there is much more drawn out. So what we'll try to explain for you guys today with the monitoring data is how that all matches up how things are progressing, how it compares to the past, and we'll get into it here in just a minute. Unless you got something else to add, Dane?
Not really. Just if you have any questions, anything like that, I'm sure everybody's kind of happy that we got good audio this week, and hopefully it'll continue all episode long. But if you have any questions, anything like that, drop them in the chat, and we'll try and get to them by the end.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Dan, for leading that discussion on the chat here. So, all right, let's switch our screen here and set up for our summary. So let's get that going here. Let's rotate our cameras around and put our summary label on the screen here. And let's share with you guys. This is our Hawaiian volcano summary for the week. What you're seeing here on screen is the newest webcam on Kilauea, the B2 camera put out by the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. This replaces the B1 camera that was moved further away due to heat from the most recent summit eruption. So the scientists are out deploying equipment on a volcano, trying to monitor what's happening underground and preparing for a summit eruption when it happens. But at present, all the activity is underground. Here are the earthquake rates and depths for the past month on Kilauea. You're seeing earthquakes per day on this left axis here, and a whole month across the bottom in this direction. So our last week has been about this much or so of the graph, and you can see that it's come up and down, but the lowest values in here are still at 100 earthquakes per day. So we're averaging somewhere in the range of 150 earthquakes per day for the last week or so. That's about normal for this last few weeks of increased activity. It was about a month ago that we saw the first ramping up of earthquake counts. And you can see it increased, decreased, increased again, decreased again. So it has a cyclicity. And we're just waiting for it to actually sustain at these higher levels, or to cycle through to the point where it can break to the surface, or relieve enough pressure underground to not actually have to erupt. So we're still waiting to see. Here is the map of earthquakes over the past week across all of Kilauea, which that graph is counting earthquakes across this whole area. And as you can see, most of the activity is surrounding Kilauea Summit. These earthquakes are plotted, they're colored by depth. So the oranges and yellows are the shallower earthquakes, and the blue ones are the deeper ones down here in the bottom left part of this image in the Pahala area that correspond to the feeder source of magma into the volcano from depth. So zooming in, you really can see that it's right around Kilauea caldera, which is this area here, but largely it's to the south of the caldera and extending a little bit to the southwest in this area we call the Southwest Rift Connector. So it's still part of the summit complex, and activity is still focused in the summit region with no further changes in activity on either rift zone, the southeast rift zone, which comes off in this direction, and the southwest rift zone, which is a little bit shallower, coming off here as well. So this is an area where we can debate the effect of the southwest rift or involvement with this activity. But in the past, we can note that there were events in 2020 and 2021 where the same southern area was active in a buildup to eruptions within the main caldera in the summit area right in here. So it's almost like an extra closet where the magma can go and fill in this area. And if it backs it up enough, it can pop out at the summit where we expect it most likely to occur. However, there have been eruptions in this area in the past. They are very rare. And unless the magma seems to migrate towards the surface in this area, we won't revisit that at this point in time. So lots of earthquakes south of the caldera, still ongoing. This is the third week of it. And the most telling signal from the area is this tilt meter measuring ground tilt at the Sand Hill Station, southwest of the caldera. And it has two colored lines on here. These are two components of tilt. The blue line is pointing more to the northeast towards Halema'uma'u, where the recent lava lakes have been active. And the green line is pointing more to the east, south of the caldera. And what you're seeing here in this summary, this really summarizes the current activity pretty well, is that the summit under Halema'uma'u is still inflating. It's still swelling with magma, bulging and the ground tilting outwards. But it's doing that at a fairly slow rate compared to what's happening to the south of the caldera, east of this station, where the ground tilt has really been dramatic and accelerating over the last week or so. So that's the summary for Kilauea. It's still a wait and see whether that buildup south of the caldera leads to something back within the main caldera, or it remains concentrated south of the summit for longer. And we'll dive into the details of this in our full update coming up next. Finally, on Mauna Loa, the story is similar to before. There are still occasional few deep earthquakes colored in blue here, one in purple. Very, very few. Mauna Loa is fairly quiet. She's still inflating and swelling as well, as shown by the ground tilt, but not to the point of causing the whole edifice and structure to quake with the pressure. So it's refilling, but not pressurized on Mauna Loa. So no threat to people from that one at the present as well either. And that's our Hawaiian volcano summary for this week. So with that said, I think I'll come next into our earthquakes. So I'll put up the earthquakes map for the whole island here. And what I've done today is select earthquakes for all of the past 30 days. And the way that this map works, unlike the previous one I showed you, there is a magnitude threshold. So if earthquakes are small enough, they don't plot on this map, because otherwise there would be too many dots and you'd see a lot less than you already do. So that threshold is somewhere in the range of magnitude 1.0 or so. It really depends. It's not quite so simple, but that's a good threshold to keep in mind as we go through this. So over the last month, you can see there have been earthquakes across all the island area, all around. You don't see quite as many further offshore because largely our instruments are here on the island. But most of these isolated single dots all around are what we call the background seismicity. That's the island adjusting to the changing movement of the land masses on it and below it as well. And that's what most of this scatter plot actually happens to be. When we zoom in into the island a little bit more, there's 3 clusters that are usually worth analyzing. One is Mauna Loa itself, fairly quiet on Mauna Loa, although you can see that there are a pattern of summit earthquakes and east flank earthquakes. And likely this area is the in-between Mauna Loa summit and Kilauea summit. So you expect that to actually be adjusting. You have Kilauea summit itself, all through here, which will be our main focus, and the rest of Kilauea off in this direction. And then these 2 clusters down here are the deep Pahala earthquakes. Now, these earthquakes are now colored by time rather than depth. So I'll put the key up here. The white and gray are a month and older. The yellow is a week. And the orange is a day. Red is 1 hour. So within the last hour, nothing's showing up, but you can see the orange ones are in the last day, all in here. And some in here as well. And then the rest of these white ones are within the last month, but older than a week. So the focus really is that. If you look at this area within Kilauea Summit, most of the yellow and red and orange is all in this area south of the summit, right through here. And there was a lot more activity within the summit caldera itself, but that seems to have quieted within the past week here, really the past 2 weeks. So that's how the earthquakes are mapping out. And since we didn't have the greatest audio and connection last week, I thought I'd review a little bit of what we went over. This is a plot from a paper by Don Swanson on a Kauai fault zone. This was published in 2018. And what he's showing here, it's really not the easiest map to see in black and white, but all these black lines are actually faults. Right? The ones that are these heavier black lines that look like this, so that's a fault. That's a fault. These 2 right here are the faults that mark the outer edge of the main caldera of Kilauea. So that's the outermost reach of it, whereas the inner caldera, the main caldera, is more in here, more or less. So there is this zone that's sometimes called the seismic southwest rift, but our preferred term is a southwest rift connector after Don Swanson here. And it has this interesting geometry where it goes south out of the summit area, and then it takes a bend to the left. And then it connects with what's often called the volcanic southwest rift zone, which is this area over here on the map, a little bit further offset. So that's how it looks on this map. And we'll pull it back to our earthquakes. And you can actually see that a little bit here. It comes down, it starts to bend in this direction, and it seems like it wants to bend like it's got a couple of jogs in there, something like that, if I were to outline it very roughly today. So that does appear to be that area. And the depth of these earthquakes also correspond. Here's one of our recent ones at 1.2 miles deep. And that's that area of that Southwest Rift connector there. How did it achieve that shape, this bent shape that kind of goes south and then goes towards the southwest? The best analogy is the East Rift Zone. And the East Rift Zone itself has a bend to it. It bends to the south and then east at Mauna Ulu. So it really has two different directions. And this is a reconstruction going back in time of how the Rift Zone achieved that bend. So you have your main magma source here at Halemaumau. And at this time, number one, the East Rift Zone connector aligns perfectly with the East Rift Zone itself. The volcano is still young and small, and it has plenty of room to grow and stretch its elbows in both directions there. What happens, though, is as it grows larger and starts leaning on Mauna Loa, starts pushing against Mauna Loa, that one elbow can't really push so hard because Mauna Loa is there. So it has to actually, if it wants to extend two elbows, it has to shift sideways and extend those elbows a little bit further over, right? So that allows that movement to happen. So it's pushing both directions as magma tries to inject blades into this rift zone. But the net result is that this area of weakness migrates to the south. So at a second point in time, you have a connector with a slight bend connecting to the main rift zone. And as a consequence, you have a secondary fault system, that's the Kauai fault system, labeled here as KFS, that extends to the west. And finally, coming to today, you have a more dramatic East Rift Zone connector, a more dramatic bend, and a larger Kauai fault system here to the south. So in that same pattern where you have pushing against Mauna Loa, the same thing is true. Mauna Loa is still over here to the southwest, the southwest rifts, or to the northwest of the southwest rift zone. And likewise, you could see that if magma is trying to inject, this rift zone could easily migrate to the south as well. So it's a complicated area. You can see that's just this complication of the southwest rift zone, both the seismic southwest rift zone and a volcanic southwest rift zone. We have this image from the USGS, which offers us both a cross section over here and a map view. And to take one at a time, you can see zoomed in here that the volcanic southwest rift is a shallower one. It connects directly to the Halemaumau magma reservoir near the surface here. And it's between, in this case, 1 and 2 kilometers down. So you're talking about a half mile or so. Right? A little bit deeper down, between 2 and 3 kilometers, you're looking at maybe 1 to 2 miles or so, is the seismic southwest rift. And so it's actually separate from the volcanic southwest rift in this cross section. And that one connects to this South Caldera reservoir, it's believed, right? A lot of these plumbing connections are inferred. It may be multiple pathways. We don't exactly know. This is our best guess with information we have at this point in time. So that's how it looks cut through in a slice through the earth in cross section. And putting it into our plan view map, looking from above, there is this interesting offset. So the shallow system, the shallow reservoir of Halemaumau within Kilauea caldera sits north of the South Caldera reservoir. So if I were to draw the main caldera on here, it looks something like this. So the volcanic southwest rift is that shallow system, and the seismic is that deeper system. And there's actually a gap on a map of a couple miles there that separates these two features. So it's very interesting when we talk about seeing this shift of activity from the Halemaumau area to the South Caldera, Southwest Rift Connector area, seismic Southwest Rift Zone. We're actually looking at a different depth of activation there and a pressurization of the system that's traveling deeper and further to the south in the volcano here. So that's really fascinating. It's basically building pressure. It's almost like it's found an extra room to put more stuff into. Or another analogy, perhaps, let's say you have an inflatable air mattress and you're pumping that thing up and it's filling and filling and filling, but it's got a fold in it somewhere. And at some point, that air you're blowing in there will get past that fold and it'll cause that thing to flop out and fill with air. And you'll have an adjustment of the other part of the mattress to relieve that pressure, but it's kind of spreading out over a larger area, even though you're putting in more and more stuff constantly into that area. So hopefully that's something you can relate to, perhaps, maybe. That's just one example I could put out as to what might be happening now with the magma. It's still coming in at the same rate. It's just found more area to fill into. The summit is bulging in a slightly different area as a result. And there is where we stand today. So it's complicated in this way as well, right? Not only you have this southwest rift bend, but you have this offset of the volcanic and the seismic. And to add further to it, and I won't go into too much detail here, but this is a slide from a presentation by Scott Rowland, professor at University of Hawaii at Manoa, on the Mauna Iki eruption of 1919 on a southwest rift. And really all I want you to take from this is that during that eruption, there were multiple areas of magma storage that fed the eruption. The eruption was off in this direction over here. It was fed by the shallow storage area through the shallow system. Later, it was fed by the deep storage area through a deeper system that came and flushed out, right? So you have these different insets through here of how this might have flushed out and different remnants of magma. Just to add to this evidence of how complex this region actually is and how hard it is to figure out what's happening underneath there. And finally, one more along those lines. This is a map from a paper from 2008 by Meyer et al. in JVGR. And this is relating to an inflation episode on a southwest rift in 2006. So what you're seeing in the background here, this largely blue color with this yellow-green right in here, is an INSAR image. INSAR is a satellite aperture radar difference between one point in time and another point in time. So the satellite flies over, it scans the ground, it has a distance to the ground from the satellite, it comes and does it again at a second time, and then it can calculate the difference in elevation between the two scans. And that's what you're seeing on the screen here. And what was shown was that over the course of, this was 9 months, or 9-month period of injection of magma into a large area in the southwest rift, fairly shallow, it looks like this. And so in this case, this comes from this paper right here, the Meyer et al. Paper. And I just wanted to read a little bit from the abstract right here that they note. The data indicate inflation occurred steadily over 9 months between mid-January and mid-October 2006, making injection of a sill unlikely. So a sill is a big blade of lava that's lying flat. Right? And a dike is a big blade of lava that's lying up and down, or more or less, mostly up and down, or mostly flat. So dikes and sills are fairly similar things, but that's what they're talking about when they say a sill here. So they're saying it's likely not that kind of event, not like a dike, not a sudden dramatic event, but rather because it takes 9 months, they think there's a large shallow ductile area, right? So there's some old lava under there that's stickier and not as fluid. And that area allows the southwest rift near the summit to move, but it also allows magma to be injected into it. So here's one more component of this really complicated area that makes it really hard for us to know what's happening with these earthquakes all through here. All this is happening underneath this area right through here. And if I note that map once again, here are earthquakes from 2004 through 2006 by different colors on a map here. You can see similar earthquake patterns all through there. And you can see that in that case, it lasted a better part of 3 years doing that. So that's the larger context of the Southwest Rift and earthquakes. That's separate from what we've mentioned in the past, which is the more obvious parallel that before the 2020 eruption and the 2021 eruptions, we saw inflation in this area south of the summit before an eruption in Halemaumau. So since that's the most recent thing that happened, personally, that's my bias, is that that's the most likely thing to happen again until we see a larger change in the dynamics of the system here. So that is our earthquake section. And we do have some images to share with you guys this week that USGS has put out. So we'll turn to our Kilauea observations. And this was a post from the USGS that was put out just after our update last week. So it's a few days old now. But they note a couple of things. First is the B2 camera that I mentioned in our summary. There is the camera itself. And if you'll recall, the previous camera that was in a similar viewpoint to this was getting pretty close to the lava lake level. And so when that lava surge in the beginning of June swept across the crater floor, it actually overtopped the rim that this camera is sitting on, further off in that direction to the northeast. But that cliff, it's got like a low point and a high point, and the camera was closer to the low point, and so they've put a new camera up. They've moved it over to the high point so that now it stands in a ledge that's about 100 feet or 30 meters higher than it previously was. So that's what they've done. The B1 camera, they had actually moved it back to a further rim, so that they kept that one intact, and now we have a second camera, the B2, added to the collection here. And as we showed you in our summary, there is a last 24-hour view from that camera down close to the ground level of that hardened lava lake floor there within Halemaumau crater. So that's the camera view, but I find more interesting what they're sharing as far as this GPS survey equipment. So last week, we tried to extract from pretty tenuous GPS data if there was a shift in the center of inflation from the volcano. It's always hard to tell, and it's reassuring to see the USGS had the same line of thought. They wanted more precise information as well, so they actually went out to the area, taking temporary portable GPS stations and deploying them in pre-established positions to do a temporary survey to get a more precise and what's the word I'm looking for? Detailed record of the deformation of the ground in that area above where all these earthquakes are happening here. So here's an example of that GPS station. They're often positioning these over benchmarks. So there's a metal plate embedded in the rock that the USGS has installed many years ago, and they keep going back to the same spot over and over year after year, which allows you to compare the data over successive years at the same spot. Here's another one looking to the south, looking out towards the ocean there. You see this interesting range of landscapes in that area. So their captions are recounting the same information on the update, depths of 1 or 2 miles in this area where these earthquakes are. Here's another one with more of a tephra strata here, the ground made of these little bits of pebbles that were explosive products of Kilauea's larger eruptions. And there it is again. You can somewhat see in this image here, not super well, but right there is the benchmark, that piece of metal embedded in a larger block of, looks like they poured some concrete in here maybe, or it's a larger block that they're able to then attach it to. And there is the GPS station centered over it and collecting data in its data logger over here. Right? Notice there's no solar panels and battery boxes and all of that. They basically have a charged power source in here, and there's a run it and then pull it out when the power is out. That's the difference between these temporary and permanent stations. So obviously a lot more work for a permanent station to install all that electronics and all the gear you need to keep it charged all the time. And then to radio everything back to where it can be collected by the servers. So temporary is a lot simpler, but you can see what that looks like here. You can put out more stations in a tighter area as needed. That's what they're doing here today. There's another side of a GPS monitor station. It's on a higher piece of ground. And you can imagine that as they're putting these installations out, they're hoping for areas that are not going to be covered in lava so that they can actually be able to reoccupy the site. Whereas if lava covers it, then you basically lose that continuity. So interesting to see that one right there. And I believe that is the last one that we have there, right? So really awesome to see. And from that, I wanted to just to share the update. Let's see. Yeah, where is our update? Let's come to our update. We'll come to our monitoring updates for the US from the USGS. So let's switch to monitoring, switch gears here a little bit, and we'll tie it back together here in just a minute. But to recap the updates over the week, the USGS has put out mostly the same messaging. There has been elevated activity of earthquakes south of the caldera. The rates have been persisting since August 22nd, and there have been occasional brief swarms. So here on Friday the 1st, they note there was a brief swarm on the evening of the 31st. I will advance from that Friday to the Tuesday, where they note another small brief swarm on the 4th. And then you come to the 6th, and you note another small brief swarm on the 6th. And you come to today finally, and they note there was no notable swarms the past day. However, they add here, so I haven't gone through most of their standard terms. So they've been saying this for all week. Recent tilt-meter measurements have suggested the southern area is inflating, independent of the usual deformation source inside the caldera. And GPS measurements over the past several days support this assessment. So that's what I was trying to get at right here, is this result has been updated into today's update finally, and they're actually noting that the southern area is inflating independent of the summit. And this is borne out by nothing we can see online, but by the reporting of what they found in a survey of the images we just saw of the GPS stations. Otherwise, the update is same as it has been. Gas emissions are still pretty low at 75 tons per day. So we will not do another VOG update today because it's the same as it's been, fairly low. With the caveat that if and when eruption does start, that's when you want to be prepared for the most amount of VOG. So if we're talking about an eruption could be happening in a summit in the next days, 2 weeks to months, this is a time to prepare for bad VOG if you live near the summit before it actually gets emitted, and we have to close all of our windows and turn on our air filters or whatever precautions you need based on your sensitivity and exposure. So that's our monitoring updates, and tying it back to that the GPS that we saw there. Now we'll talk about some of our data on the graphs. So here we have earthquakes for the past week, and this is earthquakes per day. I find this not as useful as the month-long plot because it just shows us going up and coming down, but doesn't give you as much context really, right? So we'll come back to this, but just to show you guys that the activity was fairly continuous here. And that's in contrast to our depth versus time plot. This is still that same week of time. This is the same color scheme as we have on the map. So orange and yellow is the shallow stuff, blue is the deeper stuff. And this is reassuring us that this earthquake counts we're seeing above here is within a shallow part of the volcano and not the deep root of it, which rarely but occasionally does happen. Now on here, for those of you guys who are very close volcano watchers, you'll note there's a big data gap. Not big, there is a data gap from here to here. It appears that no earthquakes occur anywhere in any depth, right? And we can say that this is not the case. And in fact, because we saw other data feeds, including the webcams, go offline at this point in time, we know that there were network issues with the USGS then, right? So just showing you what that actually looks like in case someone sees something like this again. There are all kinds of little nuances that you have to be aware of that can affect your interpretation here. So last month is where I see better context. Sorry, Dan?
On that, do you think that they'll be able to backfill that later with like an internal data set, or is that just not a priority, or what's your thoughts on that?
There are two things here. The data exists and it's certainly been recorded. So in any plots that they make in the future, the data will be included. However, these web plots are all automatically generated. And unless someone goes and regenerates this plot automatically or repopulates the web version of the archive, it may not get fixed, right? And so honestly, the 1 week timescale is the only place that shows up. I'll show you the 1 month plot here in a minute, and you'll see you can barely even see it. So
probably not.
Only for this plot does it really matter. So I would doubt
really.
there's really any, it's not really worth it.
Right.
Yeah. So here over the last month, you can see that our week that had its up and down here, and the week prior to that, and the one earlier in a month. And you can see that the peaks are getting a little bit higher. It seems our peak this week, a couple of days ago, 3 days ago, was the highest of any thus far. Right? You see this still kind of ramping back down afterwards. So it's showing that it's still able to build pressure, relieve pressure. It's not building and building and building and building and quaking more and more and more, which may happen at some point, but it hasn't come to that yet. So on that same month timescale, we have lined up here below our ground tilt at the summit. Early in the month, you saw a much more dramatic rate of ground tilt increase as the volcano was swelling underneath the center of Halemaumau. And since then, it has still been inflating. The ground tilt is increasing with variations on a daily and every few days scale through here, little deflation inflation cycles that are a common background part of the volcano. Overall, it's still been swelling, it's just not as fast. Yeah. We can note on this scale of microradians that over the last week or so, we've maybe come up on an order of, call it 5 microradians or so across that time frame. A microradian is a very small angle. If you've studied geometry and angles, there's degrees and radians. We're talking about a microradian, a millionth of a radian, so a very, very small angle that you couldn't detect on your own, but the instruments can actually detect on the ground. It's the equivalent of having a coin, like a penny or a dime, underneath a half-mile long bar of metal, and that slight tilt you'd get, that's about a microradian. So 5 microradians at this summit Halemaumau site. But on that same month tilt plot, we now come to our sand hill, and that blue line corresponds to the blue line on here. Similar, it might have a similar 5 microradian increase. But note, I'll have to read this for you guys since the plot is kind of small. This is 40 microradians up here, and this is -30, 0 is right through here. So if we just go to the last week is probably right around in there. That takes us from about 10 to 35 microradians. That's 25 microradians. So 5 times the swelling we're seeing further north. If you take it back to the last 2 weeks, that pulls it back to somewhere in here. That adds another 15 microradians or so. So we're looking at about 40 microradians over the past 2 weeks. That's an immense amount. The ground really is bulging as it quakes. But what's interesting to me is that we have seen intrusions in this area in the past, and they have often looked like a much more dramatic steep offset, something like that. And we're not seeing that here. So it seems to be a slower, more gradual process, right? Which is one reason that I've wanted to share all that complexity of the region with you guys, so you can be just as confused and puzzled as I am as what exactly is going on in there. It could be one of these slow fillings like the 9-month episode in 2006. It could be some strange geometry. It could be that there's multiple areas getting filled in multiple sequences. And it's all really hard to tell. What we can see is that the Sandhill Station is the closest one. It's really the only one picking up this scale of tilt offset, since it's the only one in range, really. And occasionally you do see like these 2 green lines shooting down right here. That's a couple of jolts from the earthquakes. So there are strong earthquakes affecting the surface at this area that are not affecting areas close by to the north as well, right? So you are seeing more of a localization in that South Caldera area there. Right, so okay, that's the tilt itself. So last week we looked at this 2-year GPS plots, and I thought I'd revisit this quickly this week. So if you haven't seen these before, these are now plotted a little bit differently. First of all, we have 2 years of time across the bottom here, and we have 3 different panels. This uppermost panel is the east-west panel, with up being to the east and down being to the west. This one is a north-south panel, and this one is an up-down panel. So for example, at Uwikahuna, which is near the site of the old Jagger Museum, you can see the ground is moving to the west, to the north, and up, generally speaking, right? We can sometimes come into the most recent data points like in here and see, okay, in this east component, it was moving more to the west, slowed down, and now it's moving more to the east a little bit more. So that's kind of hard to tell when it gets to that most recent set of data, especially considering that these data are often cleaned and refined as time goes on. But what we look for is patterns across multiple stations to see if real change is actually happening. So in the summit region, we can see nothing super convincing within the 4 stations that are right around the summit itself. There are certainly changes. The southern one here at Crater Rim, that one is one of the more dramatic ones. You can see this north-south component was moving to the south, and really within the last few weeks to month has started to move to the north again, right? So the center is shifted from within the caldera outside the caldera, is what this is telling us, while still rising up dramatically, still rising up very fast. It's just getting pushed from the opposite side. And the other station we have to the south over here is, let's see, that would be the outlet station. And it likewise is also moving up. And it was moving much faster to the south. It seems to have somewhat stalled and is no longer moving north or south as well. So that's consistent. What we don't see, and I won't linger in this too long, this is a Mauna Ulu on a southeast rift. We don't see it on a southeast rift at Mauna Ulu. We don't see that at Kananuiyohamo. We don't see that at Pu'u'o. See a little bit of a change as far as the north-south, but the up and down is still down at Pu'u'o. And the Kananuiyohamo also. Right? So maybe you're seeing some effects of the south flank, which is affecting the north-south of these, but they're not really getting injected with lava and are not rising in that area. However, if I go to the Ahua station, which is the closest one to the summit, on the south flank, then you see those patterns once again as well there, and Puhimau a little bit as well to the south, Devil's Throat to the south, and that's about the extent of it. So we're still seeing that effect more regionally than just in the caldera region. So I wanted to point out a couple of things. One is just this image that I pulled from a paper by Montgomery Brown and Michelius, 2021. And they're actually looking at the East Rift Zone in this paper. But to do that, they actually built a model based on data that was observed on a south flank between 1990 and 1996 and 2002 to 2004. And so what they have here is plotted out more or less how fast the south flank is moving in different areas. And most importantly, right here, south of the caldera region, right there, you have faster flank slip than you have off on the East Rift Zone, slower flank slip. So it's really this inflation of the summit pushes to the south. The south flank can move faster that way. In this particular image, back in that time, everything was moving to the south. But it appears today that some of these blocks in this region through here might be moving more like that, or more like that, or might be kind of rotating. Might be some kind of rotational component happening here. But it's all being pushed from the north, and really it's because this part is so dead that it's able to do that as well. There's no pushback from this direction there. So it's all consistent with what we've seen in the past as far as that slip of the south flank and why this might be happening here. And then one final thing to share is that there are other times where we've seen this same shift in inflation center. This is a paper by Walthier et al. I'm not sure if I've said that correctly. Apologies. But 2 periods here. This one is from 2007. But they're noting here period 1, P1, period 2, period 3, and period 4. And these are once again interferograms, or these are Coulomb maps actually, based from INSAR images here. And what they've basically, to summarize it here, it's pushing out in a certain direction with a red, and it's contracting in other directions with a blue. That's more or less what this kind of indicates, the principal force directions here at different points in time, which gives you the point where everything is focused around, right? So in the outline here is the main caldera right through there. And what I call the Great Caldera, the larger area right through there. So it's this very similar to what we're having it now. They actually had inflation center in the south for periods 1 and period 2, with a transition in a direction of force. It seems to be rotating around. By period 3, the inflation center shifts north to Hale Ma'uma'u, where we've had eruptions over the last few years here. In period 4, it shifts back to an intermediary position halfway to the south there. So this was a period during eruption of Pu'u'o, and there was no major change at the surface, but just showing how it can fill as it pressurizes underground. In terms of time, this was late 2007. So it was early the next year in 2008 that the Summit lava lake at Halemaumau opened up for the first time in many, many decades. So this was likewise, the volcano was filling and pressurizing, and it was able to pressurize multiple areas in sequence as it did so. And that's another parallel for what's happening now. So that's our monitoring segment. I'm going to do things a little differently this week, and I'm going to throw in our volcano watch here right now. The reason being, they address a little bit of this in today's volcano watch. So I'm going to jump here. Today's volcano watch is tilt measurements still vital to volcano monitoring after more than a century. Absolutely. We've been talking about that every week for a long time here. But let me skip past that article to start to the bottom to these final paragraphs of the article here. So they note here, currently the tilt meter at Uikahuna is not showing major tilt changes, but another tilt meter south of the caldera, Sand Hill, has shown a steep increase over the past couple of weeks. By looking back at past records, scientists recognize that this is likely due to magma accumulation in a South Caldera reservoir, which occurs intermittently, most recently in 2015 and in 2021. And that's in addition to the 2007 example I just showed you guys there. Right, so that's the crux right there. I can bring us back to this cross-section. There is a connection of that seismic southwest rift and the South Caldera region. So it's kind of this zone all through here that we're seeing swelling, right? So that's the fascinating thing there. It doesn't necessarily mean that it'll erupt to the surface from that area. It may well go through the existing plumbing through Halemaumau and to the surface through the pathways it's seen before. But as it fills, it's found another bit of space to go and swell, and that happens to be offset to the south and a little bit deeper here in the South Caldera. So hopefully that ties things more together for us all here. And that said, I'll turn to the Volcano Watch focus itself, which was the tilt meter, which was something that if you were able to catch the presentation that Don Swanson gave this week in After Dark in the Park, he talks a little bit about this as well. How tilt meters were essentially this model of tilt meter was developed here in Hawaii at HVO. So they actually called these pots water tilt pots. So water tube tilt meter. The ones we have now are not water based, but the original design did have this water hoses connecting 3 different pots, both for the water to flow between them and the air as well. And they would measure with kind of a caliper-like thing here, a little dial, the location of this level of water within this pot. And so they could actually repeat this at the same location and over time. And they actually had the 3 pots, one in the center, one to the north, one to the east, like our 2 tilt components now. And then they could tell a direction that the deformation source was coming from. So fascinating. This is posted on Hawaii Tracker already, if you'd like to read it in more detail. But that is the Volcano Watch for this week, focusing on these water tube tilt meters. What I find most fascinating, because I'm a graph guy, as you can tell, is this graph that actually plots the entire summit tilt record of Kilauea as it exists today. So I haven't seen anything this comprehensive, because obviously anything was older than now. But this goes back to 1956 here, when they first put in these water tube tilt meters. Right, and by the way, the actual case of that tilt meter is discarded artillery shell from the military operations here on island. So interesting to note, the volcano inflates with magma, and eruption happens at the summit. It doesn't often deflate, but when it happens in the rift zone, which this was the Kapoho eruption right through there, it does deflate quite a lot. And you can see there's another eruption. Every little arrow here is an eruption if it's pointing upwards and it's pink, and if it's blue and downwards, it's an intrusion. Although I suspect there are many, many more intrusions than the ones documented here. These are likely the largest and most important ones. You can see that in relative terms, the volcano largely inflated to Mauna Ulu. Mauna Ulu relieved that pressure, it brought it back down, and Pu'o'o begins right through here. And that's a much longer drawn out sequence of there is an inflation. The deflation sequence lasts decades and decades and decades and decades. And the real change happens right in here, 2005. That was the renewal of magma into Kilauea Summit. And that led to the opening of a lava lake in 2008, and ultimately to the 2018 eruption 10 years later, right through here. So here we are. We're actually on this bit of a gray line right through here. Maybe I can zoom it in enough for you to see. So here's the big crash from 2018. And since then, here's where we've come. And every little peak and drop down is one of our summit eruptions. And so here we are recovering still our groundswell following 2018. We've come nowhere close to recovering the actual amount of swelling we had from before. However, it's not exactly comparable. The level is before that collapse and afterwards, because everything broke to extreme levels, and it's hard to say that the same integrity exists now that existed back then. So you maybe can pressurize it differently than before, right? Possibly more in some areas and less in others. Still fascinating and awesome to see this tilt record. We'll refer to this as needed in the future here. Last week, Volcano Watch, we did not get in time last week, but it is also posted. It is using remote acoustic monitoring signals to distinguish volcanic styles. This is actually referring to a study that was done in Italy on Stromboli using a drone, a UAS, that hangs 60 feet below it, a sensor that can listen to the acoustic signals coming off of these different kinds of eruptions that Stromboli has. It has both these jetting eruptions as well as less jetting eruptions here. I forget what they call them here. Sustained eruptions is what they call them. So this is something that's not really practical to do at any point in time during an eruption, right? This is kind of a building your base knowledge. Having the data of how the energy disperses up in the air like this helps them to design better models that explain how the sound travels across the ground, where you actually can put an instrument in full time to monitor things all the time. And so that's really what it is. It's a little calibration data point that's really, really useful. And you can read more about that as well, if you like. So that's our Volcano Watch for this week. Our last volcano to cover is Mauna Loa. So we will switch to her here next. Not much is happening on Mauna Loa still. It's been the same as usual. But seeing as we have a new tick of the calendar, a new month of September here, we have a new monthly update from the USGS as well. She is still at volcano alert level normal, aviation code green. And the only thing to note here is the rate of earthquakes deeper than 8 miles beneath and southwest of Mauna Loa summit caldera remained slightly elevated during the past month, following a notable increase in July. Shallower seismicity remained stable, and all earthquakes were of small magnitudes. That is really the crux of it there. Nothing else is worth recapping. I can show you the data. For the last month at the summit, the tilt meter has been rising with some fluctuations, as it is expected. Over the last month, earthquakes per day have maxed out at 8, not very many, and very variable as well. So even though the ground tilt is rising like in Kilauea, the earthquakes are very different, much lower levels, and thus a much different likelihood of eruption in the short term here. Over the longer term, over the last year, here's how our earthquake rates stand on Mauna Loa. So we're really, really low compared to prior to the 2022 eruption. And in fact, prior to the whole previous 5 years of buildup, we still are at the lowest rates of earthquakes on Mauna Loa during the last 5 years. So that is Mauna Loa to share with you guys. The map for the last month looks a little bit more populated than the one I showed you at the top of the hour here, but showing this pattern of the purples and the blues colored by depth once again here, these deeper earthquakes underneath the Mauna Loa region. And in the cross section, there they are. This is depth versus longitude now, right? So this is the same area of the map, just projected down, straight down. And if there is a surface, here is these cluster of earthquakes happening over the last month or so there, and a little bit over here too. So kind of that cloud area right through there. And that is Mauna Loa. So we only have a few final community events to mention to you guys, and we can have some discussion as well. So in our community corner this week, we'll turn to our September events at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. It was too late to make an announcement after our stream last week, but it was rescheduled to this past Tuesday. The talk by Don Swanson of the Legacy of Science of the HVO on Uekahuna Bluff. So he terms this HVO on the Bluff, and that is online for you guys to watch on YouTube and Facebook as well, as you like. It's awesome to hear Don recap all the different development of volcanology that has occurred at that building over the decades. So really cool. And I feel lucky to say that I also was able to work in that building while it was in operation. So that was rescheduled. That's online. This upcoming week on Tuesday, there is Invasive Wildlife of the Pacific Islands by Dr. Stephen Hess, research biologist with U.S. Department of Agriculture, talking about alien species here in Hawaii. This is a great one for anyone who is a new arrival or off island. If you're curious about the biology and the issues that we have with invasive species here, this is likely to be a fantastic talk. It's really connects to the volcanoes in the sense that volcanoes are putting up these land masses in the middle of the ocean, far from everything. And so that makes it that everything that arrives here has to come from a long way away. You have an evolutionary isolation, so things can evolve separately here than on the mainland. You have more unique species, more native plants that are found nowhere else on the planet. But as a result of the giant moat we have, that's normally your defense mechanism against all these other creatures across the globe. When they come here by boat or by plane with people, then suddenly there's no defense against these alien plants and animals, right? And so that's kind of the first part of it. But what the national park has been doing for a long time is researching the most effective ways to restore native habitats, right, and to combat these invasive alien species. So there's a lot there. It's not directly volcanoes, but it is something that you see on the volcanoes all the time. So if you plan to visit Kilauea, this is a cool thing to note and be aware of the environment of the park. So they have their regular midweek events as well. And then the event the following week will be Search for Exoplanets, Earth-like Planets, and Alien Worlds. And so we'll address that in the future once again as well. So Dane, is anything you'd like to share about the talk that we saw this past week with Don Swanson on Tuesday?
Yeah, it was great to finally be able to do it. I think it had been canceled twice. Get to finally, third time's the charm, and we finally get to see Don talk about it. And the nice thing about Don is Don doesn't have filters anymore. Don just speaks at what he feels, and even if you disagree with him, he doesn't care, and he's just going to tell you his opinion anyways. So it's great to be able to just see raw Don up there. And it started out kind of rough, he wasn't really into it, it felt like, and then he got into it and started going on his tangents and stuff. It was great to be able to see him, and just glad they were able to get that going.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like at the beginning, I mean, most of the guys he's talking about at the beginning are gone. I mean, it is a little bit sad, right? That all these giants that he's talking about are not around anymore. That were really many of his peers that helped him get going, right? So we wouldn't have the Don Swanson we have today without all those other guys before him, like Gordon MacDonald and Harold Stearns and Eaton. So I mean, yeah, that's really fascinating. good to see it all together in one place. All the different techniques, the tilt meter we saw, the seismic network, the electronic distance measurements using lasers, all the things that developed over the years. Now it's satellites, of course, but
Right.
all that really cool stuff. Yeah.
Back when they were doing crazy things like running ropes across the caldera and using a truck to haul up carts from the bottom with rocks in it. It's like, yeah, we don't do that cowboy stuff no more. There's no rappelling down the caldera. The national park's never going to clear that.
Yeah.
Safety wise.
So that was Mako Pui crater on the East Rift Zone that they had that he was able to share more information. We've mostly heard about Kilauea drilling. We know what happened at Alai, maybe at Alai as well. But the Mako Pui drilling was fascinating as well. So we'll touch on that at some point in the future as well to share what he shared with us and share some visuals as well.
Yeah.
So otherwise, there's only one other community event that I didn't put on screen here that's coming up this weekend, Dane. You can share that with us, perhaps?
Yeah, so we got the Waimea Fire Prevention Resilience Fair is set for Saturday this weekend up in Waimea, and we're going to be participating up there. The fire department's going to be up there. Puakaloa Fire Department's going to be up there, and this is, they do this annually. It's just there's a little bit of that heightened anticipation, stuff like that with the tragedy on Maui. Now people are more, sadly, more fire aware. So, might as well prepare. And everybody's invited to this thing. Family friendly. I think they have vendors for food. Lots of stuff for the kids to do. Vibrant Hawaii will be there. We'll be there with them. We'll be demoing some Starlink stuff and some of the tech aspects of things that are coming about, and how do those fit into resilience? How do those fit into a disaster situation? And I think now people are starting to see that more and more, like how if you don't have the stuff in place before the disaster hits, it can take weeks for something to show up and be able to fill that void. So yeah, we appreciate being invited to this thing, and it is a big event, really, an annual event, and yeah, it'll be taking place up in Waimea at what is this, at Mana Christian Ohana, the town hall. So I'm sure you'll be able to find it in Waimea. And yeah, I'm excited.
The hours
on this thing are from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. So we got a 3-hour slot in there. And there'll be presentations and stuff like that. It'll be good.
Yeah, so if you're interested in the other work we do besides giving volcano updates, so this is part of our volcano education program. We're also really big on resilience, right? That's in our name as well, in our HVERI name. And part of our resilience is working with the resilience hubs on Hawaii Island. And so this is kind of showcasing that aspect of what we do, connecting with resilience hubs, making sure communication can flow from the authorities and officials to social media and our communities, from communities to other communities, and from communities back to the officials as well, right? That's really what we're trying to accomplish here. And Starlink is a big part of that, as Dane mentioned, because we can all imagine how much better things would have been in Lahaina if there had been a few more Starlinks around there at the time for communication to occur.
All right. Speaking of communication, I wanted to thank our sign language interpreters, Carrie and Dano. They've been with us now for the second week. It's a lot easier this week, I think, without having to deal with the lag and everything like that. So we really appreciate them stepping in and helping us with the American Sign Language aspect and being able to do something a little bit better than just AI-generated captions. So thank you, guys. And we don't want to just go ahead and pivot this into thanking everybody that tuned in today. We rely on viewers like you to help share, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. It really does drive the algorithm. Helps to get the scene, get it more seen as opposed to the random TikTok noise of whatever conspiracy came up lately. So we're trying to get out the real information, and sometimes that's pretty hard on the internet. So we appreciate your help. We do have some questions lined up, Phil, this week. If you want to do those. You don't.
All right. Yeah. Seems like our internet's good enough. Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. So Richard asked, is the tilting a pressure release or buildup?
So that's a good question. Richard, thanks for that. Oh, let's put that on the screen here. it all depends on the location of the tilt meter relative to where the action is happening, right? So I know that's a vague answer, but the magma can build pressure in one area and it can move to a different area, right? So it actually picks up the pressure from one side, let's call it, and then when that pressure moves somewhere else, it picks it up actually moving somewhere else as well too. So what it's all it's telling you is it's telling you a particular point on the ground. How is that point on the ground moving, tilting in 3D space? And so then you have to from that point say, okay, I know the volcano has magma reservoirs here and here, and rift zones here, and rift zones here. And then you start saying, okay, so this direction might be that rift zone, or this part of the summit, or that part of whatever. And so it's hard to generalize it to say what tilting is. So we can say more specifically, like the Uwikahuna tilt meter, which is up in this area, when it tilt increases, it's coming from Halemaumau as the closest station over here, right? And when it tilt decreases, then it's coming from magma actually leaving the area. So in that case, increasing tilt is pressure buildup of the one source closest to that station. But you can have a station that's over here instead, and it would have an opposite sense of signal, right? So hopefully that addresses
Right.
The concept there.
Nicholas asks, does the magma intruding south cause the caldera to flex inward from the south or reactivate the vent on the inside of Halemaumau?
Yeah, that's one way of describing it. Let me see if I can get the visual back on the screen here. I have too many windows. Let's see if I can find the right one.
It's always a struggle on the window tab thing.
Yeah, where did
Just trying not to crash the browser.
Yeah, I just have to find it. I think it might be this one. Maybe. Right. Okay. So this will work. So let's look at the outlet station here. The outlet station is the one south of the summit. So if I pull back let me risk pulling back my earthquake map. Here, the outlet station is more or less in here. Right. So on the outlet station, oh no, it's just let me just close my plot. So I'm gonna find it again here.
Control-Shift-T.
That's not gonna work here.
Oh.
All right. So here's our outlet station. And once again, our three components, up, north, and east at the top. And what we can see here is that the north component, right, it was moving to the south, and now it's not moving to the south anymore. Right? So that's showing that it was getting pushed from the inside out, and now that's not happening anymore. And so it's kind of hard to describe. It's still going upwards here. So it's not exactly flexing back in like you described, Nicholas. It's actually like it was flexing out from here, and now it's flexing out over here. Right? Like the center of flexing moved from here to here, right? Something like that. Right? So it was kind of bulging upwards, and now it's bulging up over here too. And it's doing this part faster. So it is the north-south component. If you're looking at the distance across the caldera, that part was stretching, and now it's compressing a little bit, very, very slightly, or it's staying still. The up and down is extending, and it's still extending, and it's still extending. So in that sense, it's not changing as far as being pushed upwards. It's more like where is it getting pushed upwards from? So hopefully that explains it a little better, Nicholas.
Okay, next question is, we'll go with one from HG here. Is it a possibility of a lava extrusion on the southwest rift zone? So assume that means eruption.
Yeah, absolutely there is. However, we have this complication here of what is actually the southwest rift zone, right? Because then that's where it gets complicated. For most people, the volcanic southwest rift zone is this area further to the north over here, right? So for magma to erupt from this area, it has to go up through Halemaumau and then make the turn down that direction. So that can certainly happen. That's how most Southwest Rift eruptions actually happen, and even still, they're rare. Even rarer still is an eruption from this area. There's been one in Western history, and that was 1974, December 31st. It was only a 6-hour eruption that emerged from more or less in here or so, somewhere in this area through here. It was active for only 6 hours and then continued as an intrusion for further weeks beyond that. So it was almost like mostly an intrusion also that had a brief 6-hour eruption associated with it as well. But most of the work was actually intrusion for that. So it's possible to have something pop out from the area where the earthquakes are now, but it would be even rarer than the Southwest Rift eruption, right? And so this kind of comes back to the cross sections I showed and the different levels. They're offset vertically and north and south as well. So yes, possible, but rare is the summary there.
Right.
And to kind of to add to that, just to restate this, we've had seismicity and intrusions in this area prior to both the recent summit eruptions at Halemaumau. So it's still the most likely thing that this area can fill to accommodate extra pressure, and it still erupts where we've seen it erupt the last 4 times. That seems to still be the most likely thing.
All right. We have one from Carl who asked, sorry. The dog is done like Carl, apparently. I saw a graph where the width of the volcano is growing. Can you explain this?
Yeah, so that's coming back to our, let's see here. Let's see what I can pull up that's gonna have this. Maybe here, maybe it'll here. So let me come to our year-long plots, if I can find them right there. So, okay. So this is the 1-year summit GPS right there. This is the distance north to south from two different stations. So this is measuring that distance across the caldera. So when you say the width of the volcano is growing, this could well be the graph you're talking about. It's showing that over the past, this is 1 year. We've gone from, this looks like, in minus 25 centimeters to positive 35. So you're looking at 60 centimeters of offset in a year of how much the ground has actually moved apart from one side of the crater to the other in 1 year. That's the big picture. You see all the little nuances in between of it moving up and down are the things we're looking at in more detail. But the way this happens fundamentally is you have magma coming into the volcano. It's filling areas underground. It's pushing the flank to the south. And that flank, once it's pushed to the south, it's not going to come back. It basically stays pushed over. So that makes space in the volcano. The magma in the far corners of the volcano has a chance to just sit there and cool and harden. And then you've basically grown the inside of your volcano while still feeding magma into it, right? If that makes sense. So it's growing by magma filling the area of the volcano and by the south flank moving to slide apart to make space for it to happen. And that's always been the question on Kilauea, is which of those factors is more important? The USGS has put it in the past as which one is in the driver's seat? Is the magma reservoir driving the car, pushing things apart? Or is the south flank driving the car, pulling things apart and allowing magma to come into the area? And the truth is, it's both, depending on what point in a volcano's lifetime. So you see it shift from one to the other, back and forth. Right now, it's filling up at the summit's swelling, pushing the south flank, and not really injecting into the rift zones beyond that. So hopefully that explains it, Carl. This is the actual measurement of it widening from one side to the other. That's actually the what I'm trying to say. That's the more reliable way that Kilauea actually grows, right? We hear about Kilauea growing by lava flows going in the ocean. It adds land, but actually the whole volcano is kind of just sprawling out and moving towards the ocean in that manner as well. So let's see. I had a image here somewhere. Where did I? Let's see if I can find that. The one that shows the patches. This one here, right? Okay. the patches of movement of the south flank, right? So there's that south flank moving apart. And here they have on their scale up to 25 centimeters. I believe this is per year, maybe. Yeah.
Hard to know.
It's written on here, but I think that's
Yeah.
per year. So, but in any case, see, it's moving pretty fast there.
All
So
right.
this whole thing is moving. Yeah, all that's moving. That's how it grows.
All right. We did have a $10 super chat from HG. Says thanks for your awesome work for the community. Appreciate that, HG. And we also have one last question from him. It says, whatever happened to the seismic sounding study the USGS HVO earlier this year with the helicopters and the nuclear density sounding gauges across the rift zone?
That is still being processed and not published yet. So it takes a long time, especially when you collect a huge amount of data. So that's one of 2 huge data campaigns that USGS has conducted in the past 2 summers. And so we eagerly await the results, but it's likely going to be still years before we see that.
All right. And then we got one from the dude is back. He asked, is there any interest in the South Flank area with the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, what you can see is just what I have on screen here. It's interesting in the sense that it's moving. The South Flank is a little bit of its own beast. It was super important in the 70s for eruptions of Kilauea, and then in 1975 there was the big magnitude 7.7 earthquake in Kalapana, and then that changed things. You could argue that led directly to the Pu'o'o long-lasting eruption that followed 6 years later. Right? So we have here in 2018 a 6.7 earthquake, not nearly as big, or 6.9, I'm sorry, not nearly as big, but still creating a good amount of offset, the large draining and collapse of the summit. And so we're still in the recovery from that large event phase of the volcano. So the most curious thing is really seeing that it's resuming the same pattern we saw before, where it is moving faster in this area and slower in this area over here. That's still happening now, and maybe it's happening more so. Right? So it's certainly of interest, and really the interest. It comes down to that. I can probably keep rambling on about this for a while, right? To talk about how our GPS signals in this area are starting to rotate, how the rift zone now is not showing any kind of inflation at all, so it seems to be kind of compressing, and how all that's different. But that's the things that go into it that affect the South Flank and how it's moving, or the South Flank is affecting by its movement, and thus affecting eruptions, right? So what the South Flank does from one day to the next doesn't really change that much unless you get one of those big earthquakes. Now, if that were to happen, then that really would be a major change for what we expect at the summit. We'd have to gauge what happened and how that would change it. We don't expect that right now. There's no signs of that. And otherwise, the South Flank it's really dominant too, but it seems to right now be moving, but it's not moving out of the way fast enough compared to how much magma is coming in. Right. So right now, in the race of who gets to drive, the magma is got more push, and seems to be doing the bulk of the work at the summit towards an eruption there.
All right, getting into the final questions. Richard asks, can Kilauea's tilting be caused by Mauna Loa's pressurization? Is there a
yes, I think that's something we have to revise and answer. If you'd asked me this question like 2 years ago, I probably would have said no. We had never seen that happen. But in 2022, we did see that happen, actually. We did see how the inflation of Mauna Loa prior to its eruption in 2022 caused a compression of Kilauea summit, caused the reduction of lava output at the surface, led to an intrusion below Kilauea summit, and ultimately you could call it a pause in a summit eruption, or end of summit eruption and the start of a new eruption between December and January from 2022 to 2023.
Right. And then finally, from Nicholas, did September 5 have a magma intrusion under Halemaumau or the adjacent area?
I think now it's a term of semantics, really. Like it's kind of how you want to classify your intrusion. You could say that there are swarms, right, of earthquakes, and swarms of earthquakes quite often correspond to intrusions. But if you were so in that sense, you could say, yeah, it's filling. There's magma going in there. It's filling that area. It's intruding. But we've seen already in one paper described the one about the 2006 inflation, talks about how it lasted 9 months, and therefore it was more of a long-lasting event, and they would not call that as much an intrusion. Maybe so. That there's some gray area there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we can say is that, I mean, from my point of view, magma has been injecting into this area likely since late August. And it does so sometimes slightly more passively, and sometimes more actively. When it's pressurizing and more active to create more space, you see the earthquake swarms. So the swarms do give you an indication of how much they're pressurizing. Not that the swarms are the be all and end all, but how often they're occurring does give you some indication for how often is it reaching its limit to have to cause more cracking with the pressure it already has, which tells you it's not really relieving that much pressure if it's swarming every single day. Whereas now, if we see the reduction in swarms continue, then you might say, okay, maybe it's bought us some time. It found enough area to the south to cause the summit to deflate, for example. The summit could actually switch from inflation to deflation if you move enough material from that north to the south area. We haven't seen that yet convincingly. We've only seen a slowdown of the rate in the north. So you still have to believe there's enough magma coming in to fill both areas, and more of it's going to the south there.
All right. You want to do one more? Or is that good?
Sure, we can try to knock out one last one.
One last one came through from Chris on Facebook. Asks, is there any historical data that matches what's happening now in the Southwest Rift Zone?
Well, I feel like I've been talking about that all day here. So yeah, 2006, yes. We mentioned, 2021, we mentioned 2015, we mentioned 74, we mentioned
a bunch of them.
Didn't mention 71 so much today, but yeah, so we'll leave it at that. Yeah, so there's lots of similar stuff. None of it matches exactly, but the closest one is the most recent stuff where we saw similar swelling of earthquakes prior to eruptions in Halemaumau. That the last two times were about 1 month after we saw this earthquake activity to the south.
Right.
So that's still our expectation, is that within the next weeks to month, we'll see some new stage of this process here on the summit, whether it's an eruption or something like an intrusion that's more. Something has to change within that time frame. They can't just keep going as it is indefinitely.
Right. All right. Well, I think that does it for us. I want to thank Carrie and Dano for the sign language interpretation. Appreciate that. I want to thank Two Pineapples. If you haven't seen Two Pineapples, was the last recording on their channel for the Don Swanson talk. Definitely check that out. And they'll be, of course, if it goes off, they'll be up there live streaming the day of, capturing the big fountains and all that kind of awesome visuals that the early hours of an eruption brings you. So we appreciate Two Pineapples sitting on the back end helping produce this thing. And I think that'll do it for me on Tracker. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Dane. Thank you, Carrie and Dano. And thank you, all you guys who are contributing in a chat and supporting us as well. And unless something pops up between now and next week, Thursday, at our usual time of 5 p.m. Hawaiian time, we will see you then on Thursday. And if something does happen, we'll be here before then, of course.
Right.
So, mahalo, everybody. From HVERI, I'm geologist Philip Ong, Dane DuPont, Carrie and Dano. Aloha, everybody.